everyone. Thanks a lot for joining these new sessions of the CEPR Media Plurality Network. We are very, very, very glad today to have Anya Schiffrin from Columbia University and Haaris Mateen from the University of Houston. Thanks a lot for all of you who are joining, either from the network, and Anya was one of the very first members of this Media Plurality RPN, and to all the other participants. So we are going to discuss a key issue that is whether or not platforms should pay for the news they use, and in particular, how much they should pay. Anya and Haaris have published like a super important piece on this topic. There is a lot of debate around their work since its publication. So it's really great for us to have the opportunity to first have a detailed presentation of the work that has been done, and then to have like a discussion all together about, I guess, the optimal policies that should be implemented. So the floor is yours. I let you share your slides, and basically you can go up to like presenting your work, and then we will open the floor for questions.
That sounds perfect. We're just going to share our slides now. And I thought that I could start with the policy implications, and then Haaris can go into the detailed economic calculations if anyone's interested, and we will take questions throughout. So we're happy to take questions during or after the presentation. Can everybody see our slides?
Yes, I guess it's perfect. It's
great. So we published a working paper in November, where we calculated what we think Google and Meta owe US publishers. And we think that this has global implications. So we're going to take you through some of the policy implications. And sometimes it's hard to advance the slide when you're sharing. Okay, good. So the basic problem, and this is a global problem, including in France, is that the platforms have historically not paid what they should be paying, given that they're making so much money from distributing news on their platforms. And Google and Meta are really who we wrote this paper about. And now, of course, because of OpenAI and the large language models, the problem is becoming even more serious. Around the world, news publishers are saying, you know, this is a terrible situation because so much money is being made. News is a huge part of the content, and we're just not getting proper payment. So different parts of the world are dealing with this global problem in different ways. In the US, for many reasons, we don't tend to have federal legislation around things like supporting journalism or platform regulation. So in the US, there's a lot of lawsuits at the moment. Both Australia and Canada passed laws that pushed Meta and Google to negotiate directly with the publishers. And in Australia, they used the Competition Authority to do that. In Europe, of course, what's happening is there were many earlier attempts in France and Germany and Spain, Denmark, other countries. But now I think mostly what we're seeing in Europe is the transposition of the EU copyright directive. And the bargaining codes that happened in Australia, I think, were instrumental in pushing Google to negotiate and settle in France, for example. What's also happening around the world is where there are no laws or court cases, there are settlements that are being made directly with the platforms. And so Google is going to many countries, and including the US, and are making arrangements with the publishers and then asking them to sign non-disclosure agreements so that the amounts are kept secret. But from what we understand, the amounts that are being given to publishers are much smaller than should be given, because we think that the news content is actually very valuable to Google and Meta, but also for use in the large language models. So this is the overall problem. Australia, I'll just talk about for a minute. What happened there was in 2021, Rod Sims, the former chair of the Australian Competition Authority, pushed a law that was passed that requires Google and Facebook at the time to negotiate with publishers for the price of news. And he was really trying to rectify a power imbalance because the platforms are so powerful and the publishers really aren't. So he wanted to avoid a situation where, one of the Australian newspapers comes along and says, you owe me $10 million, and Google says, we owe you $20. And then they negotiate for years, and then the publisher goes bankrupt or they can't afford to pay the lawyer. So what they required in Australia was a form of negotiation that arbitration that they use a lot in Australia, which is called final offer arbitration. And the idea is that the two sides come together with if they can't agree, then they must come to a government appointed arbitrator with their very best offer. And the arbitrator will choose one or the other. So this immediately forces people to come closer together. And it's a very efficient market-based way of solving or addressing this problem of platform remuneration. There were worries in Australia that it was a giveaway for Rupert Murdoch by a conservative government, and that the smaller independent outlets would get squeezed. But actually, they got payments too. And The Guardian Australia has now hired a lot more reporters. And the smaller outlets also were able to band together and negotiate, and they got payments as well. I've been told by Rod Sims that I think the amount per journalist was actually higher for the smaller publications than the large ones. And so there were a lot of threats from Google and Facebook, but eventually they increased the payments to the publishers. And then, of course, we saw that Google started to settle the copyright disputes in France. We gathered in July. We said, this is a good law, but it's not as good as it could be. So in July last year, publishers and communication scholars and media development people gathered in South Africa, and we declared global principles for bargaining with big tech. And we really wanted to improve on what Australia did. We said we would like to see transparency, so we know who's getting what. And we'd like to see guarantees that the money is going to journalism. None of us want to see the publisher or the shareholder start getting lots of money or bigger salaries for management. We want to know that the money is going to be spent on journalism. And we want to make sure that the small outlets get funding as well as the large ones. Unfortunately, many countries have not yet been able to pass these laws. And so again, what's happening is Google is making these direct payments. They're also spending a lot of money on lobbyists. And in many cases, they're going to government and saying, we don't really need your news. And I guess our response to that is, if news isn't important, then why are they fighting so hard to avoid paying for it? They could just walk away, but they're really not walking away in most cases. So Facebook did block Australian news for a few days, but they restored it after, I think it was 6 days. And and then there was a government review in November 2022, which found that the code has been a success to date, and that more than 30 commercial agreements were signed, and that it was unlikely these would have been signed without the bargaining code. There's still a lot of secrecy in Australia about how much money was put into the system, but other countries took a look and said, this looks interesting. So Canada passed their own version, the C18, last summer. Indonesia has been discussing it. South Africa has begun the process, which is a platform market inquiry. And in the US, we have the Journalism Competition Preservation Act, which is a federal act that probably won't get voted on anytime soon. And then California has also looked at has proposed their own law. State Senator Buffy Wicks has proposed it. And again, there's a huge debate happening in California right now. We're not sure. I think it passed the lower house, but I'm not sure if there will be a final vote. What we're seeing, however, is that even with these laws, the payments that are being made are lower than what we think is fair. So 4%, this is from Hal Singer, who's an economist who's been working for the News Media Alliance in the US, which is a lobbying group. He says that in Australia, the amounts paid out were about 4% of Australian Google search revenues, and in Canada, only 1.7% of Google search revenues. So we think that's still too little compared to what is actually owed. We're now even more concerned because of the large language models. We think that publishers and governments should learn from what happened with the bargaining codes. And it's really important to have collective action and collective negotiation in order to get a fair price. Companies like OpenAI will need to pay for content, and you can do better if you negotiate collectively. It's an arms race. They're in a hurry. The large language models are so expensive to produce. I think it's something like $100 million. And I think now there's only about 7 of them. So it's a time, I think, when for once publishers have some power in this negotiation. Although we can see that the small open source companies will probably just steal content. It'll be hard to do anything about it. And one of the things that we emphasize in many of our talks is that right now, because of the way the large language models are structured and how the metadata gets stripped out, you can't actually tell whether your content has been used. Although in the new lawsuit with New York Times against OpenAI, it's a 70-page lawsuit, and you can read it. You can find it online. They have a lot of examples where the prompt will say, please tell us about one of the New York Times stories. And then what comes back is actually large blocks of text from the New York Times itself. And there were also other problems where I think the chat GPT responded with things the New York Times hadn't actually said. So they were first stealing the content in many cases, but also in some cases even hurting the New York Times credibility by saying they'd said things they had never published. So really important to understand that a paywall doesn't protect your content if you're a publisher. And what you have to do is put in your terms of use that the content cannot be used for training. I think last year, I think it was about 35 US publishers had already done that. But in many countries around the world, this has not been done. They don't know. So we're definitely worried about this. And we think that there are some opportunities for producers of reliable content in languages that are not English. So we think that Spanish, Portuguese, possibly French content may be useful and valuable. And then we also understand that images, video, historical archives add value to what publishers are producing, and they can consider this when they're negotiating with OpenAI and the other companies. Another thing that's interesting for them is that where there are journalists who can answer questions about how the content was produced, this can also be useful for the large language models, and therefore that may be another way of getting more revenue for the content. So we think that this is a good moment to learn the lessons from the previous decades and really try to get publishers to work together to negotiate collectively. In the US, we're seeing a whole lot of different things happening. Just in the last couple of months, they've announced content deals with OpenAI where they're really not getting very much money. So OpenAI and the Associated Press have made a deal. They're talking to many other publications. And I think that the negotiations broke down with the New York Times, which is why the New York Times is suing. Barry Diller, the chairman of he's one of the major media moguls in the US, gave a interview to Kara Swisher, the tech journalist, I think it was in August, where he said, listen, we need to change copyright law because fair use is no longer fair. And he threatened to sue the large language models and OpenAI. And I'm not sure if anybody else is joining his lawsuit, but the reality is it's a good idea. And unfortunately, at the moment, separate deals are being made. I see there's a question in chat, so I'm going to take a look here. It's the point, I think, that the small companies are just maybe less likely to negotiate, and you'll have many actors. So I'm not sure if it's that they're small or if they're just more or less worried about their reputation and perhaps less financially able to pay large amounts of money. I don't know, Haaris, if you have a view on that.
Yeah, smaller open source. The problem is of fragmentation. So if there's so many smaller players who are, gathering data, it becomes hard, becomes costly for publishers to negotiate with them one after the other. And they're often, probably not as, they're not big enough targets from a publisher's perspective. So that's basically the main reason why.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure how many economists are on this call, but we would be really happy for Haaris to take you through some of the methodology for how our work was done and how the calculations were made. Would that be of interest? Should we proceed with Haaris talking a little bit about why we know news is valuable and what we think a fair split for news would be?
Yeah, I guess it would be very useful, because I am not going to say that the majority of the people are economists, but I guess a large share of the people attending the call are.
Great. So Haaris will now get technical. I'm not the economist, he is, and I will also be here and answer questions, but I'll move to the side so he can take the floor here.
So thank you. It's not going to be very technical, but just a few points that I think the audience, would be able to appreciate. And it starts off with two observations. The first one is, if I search for something like Ukraine on the Google search bar, I do get some basic information about Ukraine, but I also, and importantly, I think for a lot of people who search for Ukraine these days, or for a year now, it brings up news stories and snippets about recent news events, right? So that's observation one. I think it's very hard to imagine a lot of search queries that we make on Google search that does not involve news items that are of interest. And more importantly, I think, and we've been talking to media people, also media practitioners, a lot of us are guilty of consuming content right off the Google search results rather than clicking on these links. So that's observation one. Observation two was somewhat similar, but different also, in the sense that when you look at social media, and a lot of discussion is now on TikTok and Instagram, but if this is the example of Facebook, a lot of news articles are often, or news discussions are initiated by our friends. The discussions or debates or arguments in the comment section are no less heated than anywhere else on the planet. And this also, the amount of news that people consume on Facebook, for example, also includes the content that news publishers share. Which is both to say that these two observations get into this idea that news content is very much part of Google search and of social media. We're concentrating on Facebook in different ways, but in important ways. And we want to understand what, we wanted to put a number on what would be the value that this news content produces for these two platforms. And so just as an overview of the paper that we wrote, it's for an economist audience, I think it's actually just streamlining a set of ideas that economists deal with almost on a daily basis. The main thing that we do is we just look at the relationship between a platform. When I say platform, I mean Google search or Facebook in this in the paper, and publishers. We see the relationship between them as a symbiotic relationship, or as we'd like to call it, a cooperative bargaining situation, where both sides are producing value jointly. They're producing value separately, but when they get together, they're producing something in excess, which we like to call surplus. And so basically, we recast this association of these two entities in terms of that sort of a lens. And what we then do is then we ask ourselves, just through numbers, what is the amount of money? What are the revenues that are being generated by Google search and Facebook from news content, right? So what is the percentage of of revenues that are being generated by news content? And then what we want to do is we want to split this between these two parties, right? So what we find, these are very eye-popping numbers, but as I'll show you, they're very robust to changes in assumptions. We find that Facebook owes almost $2 billion to US publishers annually for use of content on platforms. Google, similarly, Google Search owes $10 to $12 billion to US publishers. We used a 50-50% benchmark split between the platform and the publisher for the revenue that is being generated by news, right? So only for the revenue that's being generated by news, we want to split this 50-50. We base it on a large body of economic theory. But what's nice to see is that we also look at a rich database of platform publisher agreements around the world. And we find that quite often 50-50, 40-60 is what publishers and relevant platforms have existed on. And lastly, what we also find, and Anya talked about this, was that payments that are being made right now are vastly below the estimates that we have of fair payments. In fact, if you perturb a lot of the assumptions in our in this paper, you'll still find numbers that are well in excess of anything that, say, Google or Facebook pay to news publishers. And so not going to spend a lot of time, but I just want to clarify a few things that we found when discussing this issue with people in the media, economics, media practitioner community. What we're getting at is the joint value that is being created by platforms and publishers. We always know that, we hear it a lot often from platforms that, publishers have this nice channel where they can give their content, and that's accessed by a lot of people. But the other side of the equation is often not talked as much, which is that news media is often a source of high quality content that keeps users engaged and coming back to the platform. Whether it's quality or quantity, it is a fact that a lot of content on platforms, and there are various ways to get to that number, is derived from news content. However, this value that's being created by news content on the platform side, for example, the idea that I know for a fact that whenever I use Google, if I want to know something about, there's a snowstorm right now in New York as we speak. If I want to know something about the snowstorm, I just write snowstorm, right? I don't write snowstorm news. But I know that the first few results that I'll get will be relevant news from news publishers. And so what that does, and what we're trying to get to, is that value is useful in the direct sense that I'm using Google for news, and news is available to me, but it also builds a kind of habit for me. It builds trust for me in using Google in general as a rich source of information. And that habit and trust has a lot more value for Google, both in terms of the data that they get, but also in terms of just habit formation and usage that they can then monetize, say, for commercial searches. However, and we talk about this in the paper, and there's a lot of discussion out there in policy circles. Market power means that platforms do not have to pay downstream. One way in which you could look at this as an economist, these are all pieces to the puzzle. They're not like causal statements. But you can see that if you plot advertising revenue as a percentage of GDP, you find that there are like these two big events that you could sort of place on this timeline. One is when Google becomes the default search engine for Yahoo, and the other one is when Facebook opens up to a community outside of some elite colleges. You find that there are these drastic declines in the advertising revenue that these entities have. This point was pointed to us by Professor Andrea Pratt at Columbia, that one narrative is often that maybe this is what this is because news consumption itself is no longer very popular. But you don't really find any evidence for that. What you do find, of course, is that news consumption has shifted from print media and TV or broadcast media to online. And online, it remains very stable. A lot of people access directly websites and apps, but a lot of them use search and social media. And I think some of us love podcasts as well. So all this to say that there's something happening in this relationship between the platform and the publisher. And then the next obvious question is, if we think that there is this symbiotic relationship, if there's surplus value that's being generated, what's the best way in which you can put a number to this? Ideally, of course, we'd love a natural experiment of pure study, which we could do between one side and the other. But as you'd understand it, the problem is messy, and we wanted, a good way of putting a number on this. The way we went about it is thinking about user impressions, which is basically the idea of how much engagement there is for a user through a content. It's not only the direct user engagement, as I said before, that I'm looking at the snowstorm that's taking place right now, news about it. It's also feedback effects and network effects. The feedback effects that I talked about, just this idea of habit and trust, and network effects in the sense that if a larger community uses a particular platform, naturally it is in the user's interest to stick to it. But it's also in the interest of advertisers, because the advertisers know that there's this large community of users who are going to be using that platform. The most important thing in all of this is that click-through is very much downstream. Click-through is conditional on you first consuming that content on the website, on the search engine, or on social media, and then deciding whether you want to actually plunge into it or not, right? So not getting into this monster of a slide, which is basically that news is valuable to Google, just what I've already said, that it's not just the direct effect, it's also the attractiveness, the value, the credibility of Google search as a search engine, which has all kinds of benefits coming from network effects, from downstream effects, from the data that they give, etc. So the big question then is, how do you make this work, right? It's nice to talk about it conceptually, but how do you get numbers for this? And the way we do it is we split this up into 3 parts, right? First of all, you need the ballpark. You need to start off with the relevant advertising revenue for the platform. So that's typically not that difficult, especially for countries. You can get this data from company filings about the relevant advertising revenue for Google search. And for Facebook, we concentrate particularly on Facebook. I'll come to some of the questions that I get, but let me just complete this. I'll come back to that. So that's the starting point. Then you want to calculate the news related revenue that's being generated, because you want to only concern yourself with the share of advertising revenue that can be attributed to news content. What we do here, and I'll just quickly explain that, is that we use state-of-the-art studies. We use recent studies to put a number on how much of revenue is being generated by news content. And then finally, you can think of it as a simple problem theoretically, but a very difficult problem on a practical level. How do you split this revenue that we think is being generated by news content, right? So just to explain the middle section, which is how do we think about calculating the payment that the news related revenue that is being generated. The idea is that it's tricky, because what I just said is a lot of effects. So the way we do it, we looked around, and the best approach that we think is appropriate for the situation is asking the following question: how much of the user base of Google search would stop using Google search if news content was not present on its platform? This does not ask, it should be pointed out, how much of search is happening by users. It's not asking about the supply of news content on the platform side. It's asking how much of the user base thinks of news content on Google search as a must-have, as something without which I don't get utility from this. And so what we do is that there was this recent study by Fair Research in Switzerland. What they did was they had this little experiment where they had audiences consuming a version of Google without news content and a version with Google news content. And they were looking at user engagement patterns. And what they come to as a number is about 35% of all demand for Google searches is from users seeking news content. Again, this is not the supply of news content. This is not the number of news searches. It's very precisely how many of the users think of news content as a must-have. The example that I like to think about is that I subscribe to a cable service here in the US. The reason I do that is I love football and I love watching it sometimes during the weekends. I consume news, I consume movies, whatever sitcoms, etc. But without the sports content, I have no value for being subscribed to this service. So that's the number that we use. And then once we have the ballpark estimate for the amount of news related revenue, we split that 50-50%. Now you could argue with the 50-50 split. That's just a benchmark number that we use. I think what's important to understand here is that in these three stages, in the middle stage, I used a 35% number. In the third stage, I used a 50-50% number. These numbers can be changed very easily to get the kind of numbers that are more appropriate, let's say for a particular country. The point of the whole exercise was to present one method, a transparent method that is easily replicable and can be used to calculate a starting ballpark number that can be used for negotiations. Right. You could also do this for Facebook. Facebook is different, obviously. It's a social media website. And what we do is that we use usage patterns from this Hunt Alcott et al. Paper. They've got their data set available online, as happens with a lot of journal articles. We use the raw data, we clean it up, and we find that about 13% of time is spent consuming news. And we use that to get to a figure of $2 billion. This is after the 50-50% split. You can try this. You can play with this. We also released an app that my friend very generously made free for where you can change these numbers and play around and get your own numbers. Happy to share that later. One validation exercise that as researchers we love to do is to figure out where are the other studies sitting in if we look at it from our methodology. And you can see that the black dots or the dark blue dots are benchmark agreements from existing licensing agreements. They're typically 40-60 or 50-50. The orange dots are the ones that have been agreed and from the information that we get publicly. What's the best thing for me here is that if I look at the amount of money that Australia paid, through their own methodology, through their bargaining code that well predates our efforts here, and you just plug those numbers in and you look at what would be the percentage split that they had using our methodology, it's a 40-60 split. So that's nice validation. Obviously, as we get more data, we'd like to streamline this and make this much more concrete. But knowing that the Australian example did lead to a 40-60 split is good validation for our exercise. What about subscription revenue already received? You could easily offset that. That is easily dwarfed by the amount of revenue that's being made by news platforms. What if platforms reduce news content? That's where Anya has talked about, substitution patterns are important. Some jurisdictions are smaller markets. Platforms have more bargaining power. Some places like Japan, we've been talking with the publishers in Japan, is a very unique market because there are no other Japanese publishers. And therefore, despite, and it's a large market. So whether platforms can substitute you away from, say, by closing down Spanish language publishers, but still having the rest of the Eurozone news content being available, or being just able to, substitute one news organization with another. So we could get into all of that. We've talked about AI. The conclusion that I'd just like to make here is that the whole idea of this exercise was to just straighten out our thoughts on this. The methodology is like completely tweakable and changed. You can change it to get your own numbers. But you could change the 35%. You could say, no, that's not true. Let's say it's 10%. You could say it's not 50-50%. The split should be 30-70. You'll still get a number that's beyond whatever the platforms are currently facing. So I'll stop here, but I'll look at the questions.
Yeah, Harry, so we have a few questions in the chat. Like, thank you for your presentation. We have some questions from Tom Farrell from the UK media regulator Ofcom. Tom, would you like to make the questions yourself? Yeah, Tom,
Can you hear me?
I guess we can hear you now. So would you like to make the questions?
Yes, please. Thank you. Really interesting methodology there. So I had a couple of questions. The first one was just about how we define joint value. And I guess I'd always thought about it as when the publishers and the platforms get together, they create two things. The platform gets the value of people being on their platform and consuming news on their platform, but also there's a link out, and then there's traffic to the website. And that also generates a value that's captured by the publishers themselves. And the platforms have always traditionally pointed to that and said, well, that's their side of the bargain. Everything's fair. So when we're thinking about joint value, shouldn't it be 50% of that joint pie, if you like, both sources of income or sources of value that are generated, rather than just the half that goes, or the chunk that goes to the platform?
Yes, perfect question, Tom. And that's and I'm glad you said chunk rather than half,
yes.
Because there is a chunk that is going to publishers through click-throughs, right, and any kind of other kinds of subscription revenue that goes in. And we mentioned this in our paper. Our focus has been to really capture the side that's being generated on the platforms, which is remarkably large. But as we mentioned in the paper, about any kind of revenues that are being generated, or let's say, to be very technical, surplus is being generated. Some part of that surplus is being generated on the platforms, and some part is being generated on the publisher side, right? What you'd like ultimately is to calculate the platform side, the chunk that's made on the publisher side, and you'd want to split that 50-50%. So that's perfectly consistent. We have done some back of the envelope calculations. It's been hard for us to get great data for the amount that's being generated on the platform, on the publisher side. And I think it's very clear that offsetting this does not change the magnitude of payments that are being made, although it would reduce them. So I agree with that. It should be offset against the chunk that's being generated on the publisher side to the tune of 50% also.
I see.
And then there's this question about Facebook versus Google, and are they different?
Yes. So that's there's a question by Maria, which is about, isn't Facebook different from Google? Absolutely. So as we discussed in the paper, it's like I'm trying to make you all read our paper, but in Google and Facebook are very different. Google search, as you can imagine, even intuitively, the business model, the idea of Google search really is connected with news content. I think it's very hard imagining a Google search without news, right? And therefore, the ability of Google to remove news completely from its platform is different. So that changes the outside option, that changes the threat point. So basically, it changes the bargaining dynamics between them. Facebook is different. As we've seen, and Anya has been discussing this with many regulators, Facebook has managed to remove news from Canada. It has threatened to reduce content, and I think the best evidence that we have is that they have reduced it. And therefore, it is conceivable that they have more ability to just shut out news from their ecosystem. Now, the question in our mind then is, how much of an impact does it have on its attractiveness? It's a question that we can only speculate. From the lens of the lens that we used in the paper, we think there would be a reduction, a sizable reduction in value for Facebook that would happen from the reduction in news content, and that would not be that'd be something that they would worry about. But we agree. I mean, Facebook is different from Google search. I think Google search is clearly a clean case where news content is being used. Facebook, it's about changes with countries, changes with the again, substitution patterns that are available. People consume news not only from social media, but others they consume from other kinds of social media also. A lot of discussions can often take place in the absence of news content also. People just sometimes complain about certain things happening without posting a link. So that point is well taken, and we make that distinction in the paper. I don't know if Anya wants to add something.
Yeah, no, I was going to say in the paper, we're very clear that what we estimate is the amounts that Facebook owes publishers are much, much lower than Google. But I think what's so interesting is that, when Emily Bell read our paper, she said, we've really changed the discussion from millions to billions. And I think that when you look at what the platforms are giving, or what Google is giving to news outlets, the amounts are so incredibly small. So if you go to Google and you're a publisher and you say, we think you owe us 100 million, Google will say, we'll give you 10 million. And if you go to them and say, you should give us 10 million, Google will say, we'll give you 1 million. And if you're really small and you're in a medium income country, they'll say, we'll just give you $20,000 a year. So I think that one of the main points that we're making to regulators and to publishers is that honestly, the amount should just be much, much, much bigger, even if you take out subscriptions, for example. It's just shocking how little has been given.
Okay.
And of course, we
this-
think it's important to establish principles, and one of them is that money should be paid. There are property rights to this content.
So Anya, this might be a question for you on the political economy of that. I completely agree with what you did, and I completely agree with your main conclusions. But we know, and this was clear for what happened to the European regulations, for example, this is also clear from what happened recently in Canada, that at the end of the day, even if we have the good numbers, it's a little bit, let's say that we need to be very, very optimistic to hope that the regulators are going to win the fight against the platforms. So from the point of view of let's say political economy, so now you put the numbers on the table. We have a fair and consistent basis for discussion. But how do you make the discussion happen?
Well, I think it's really important for the publishers associations to work with government and to really push government to act. And what we're seeing in many parts of the world, when there is support for journalism, it's different in Northern Europe, where there's a whole structure in place for supporting journalism. But when you look at some of the more recent initiatives in the US or in parts of the world where there hasn't historically been support for journalism, it's really very often been, somebody in the government who starts to understand why this is a problem and decides that they should do something. So my very practical advice is that journalists should be writing about this, and news organizations should be speaking to regulators about this, which is part of what we're trying to do. Is just to kind of raise awareness. And, I don't think that this is going to be a solution for decades. I don't think, I understand the criticism from some people that it's not healthy for outlets, news to be dependent totally on big tech. But I think our point is pretty clear that the publishers have been underpaid, they're owed money, and they should be getting money. I'm not saying this is for the next 50 years, but definitely in the short term, there's money that's owed and should be given.
But if I want to be a little bit more pushy, if you look at what happened in the past decades, for example, in Germany, at some point the publishers, they decided that they will ask Google to pay, and then they needed to abandon these ideas. The same thing happened at the level of Spain. If you look at what happened during the summer, at some point, Facebook, to protest against the regulations, they just stopped publishing information, while basically people were their house were on fire And then Facebook decided, no longer to publish the content of like national newspapers, local newspapers, so people were uninformed. So like, I do agree that you need some politicians to say, okay, this is important. We need the publishers to say this is important. But given the weight, and including political weight, but not only political weight, the importance the platforms have today, and the fact that they can, or they use at least, to use big threats, so that the regulations are abandoned. How do we make it happening?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. I mean, one is some countries have included must carry provisions and do not retaliate provisions. So you could put into the law, maybe in the US with the First Amendment, it would be difficult. But in Brazil, they were talking about putting in a must carry provision, just saying you can't drop news just because you have to pay for it. So that's like one regulatory thing that could happen. And then the other thing is just the purely practical. Like, are governments around the world just going to give up and say, oh, well, they're so big and powerful, we can't do anything about it? I mean, the reality is that talking about these laws raises the amount of money that Google is willing to pay. And this is exactly what happened in Canada. So even if you want to be really cynical, you should still push for these laws, because then you can get more revenue from the platforms.
Yeah, just to add to this, I think there's the coordination problem, right? In the sense that it's very easy for Google search to cut a deal with one news organization, and that just weakens the ability of other organizations, especially smaller outlets, to be able to have any kind of say in this. So there is a need for a coordinating device, and a law or a regulation is often the best way to do that. That also ensures, not in all circumstances, not in all markets, but I think about the California example. California is a huge market. It's 14% of the US GDP, and it is the tech state. It seems a little less plausible that Google search can just completely shut out news in that state. But that is again based on the political economy of that place. So it does matter a lot from region to region. What is interesting is that any deal is a precedent-setting deal. So now we're getting a lot more interest from people who've looked at the Canada deal and have said that, what, it is less money, but they actually paid. And even if you take that money and you extend that to a lot of countries across the world, that's still a lot more money than what they've paid till now. So I think getting any kind of action also creates precedents that make it more difficult for them. So it's basically trying to change the ability for them to be able to exercise credible threats.
Yeah. Here's this question from Jordan Ogg, which is, what will the New York Times case against OpenAI, what effect will that have on everybody else? And I think, I mean, I'm not an expert, I don't know, but my guess is that if OpenAI can make an agreement with a few large quality publishers, then probably they don't need to make agreement with everybody else. I mean, I think one of the difficulties in life is if something happens, like there's a snowstorm in New York today, everybody's going to report on it. Fox, New York Times, Reuters, BBC, local news. But if you're OpenAI and you have an agreement with the New York Times, then you probably don't really need the content from the other people as much. So that's why we've been really hoping, that the publishers would stick together. And that's why we thought, Barry Diller's lawsuit, if it happens, could set a precedent that would apply to everybody. But if New York Times gets a great deal, then it may hurt the other outlets, I think. Or, I don't know. I mean, if they make some kind of, I think that's why we really need government. I think that's why we need regulation, and I think transparency, so that people can benchmark. Because right now, the small outlets and the small countries that don't have huge legal teams don't really know what's being paid. And they don't know what the standards are. And we're trying to figure out right now if we could write something about, when you're an outlet, like what do you have that's valuable, and how should you negotiate? And that's why we did this paper, and we replicated, we used the methodology of the Swiss economists paper, because we're trying to set sort of, global understanding of what the numbers are and what the parameters should be and what a good framework would look like. Did you want to add?
No, I think.
Are there any other questions?
Anya and Haaris, I have a question as well. So regarding the policy implications of your paper, for example, we see that there's a lot of discussions on developing countries as well and less developed economies and how they can have this bargaining power to negotiate fair remuneration of journalism. So where do you think that this bargaining power actually lie? Because I don't know if it lies, for example, in the user population size that these platforms have in each country, or, you know, where do you think that this bargaining power that countries have or could have to negotiate fair conditions and fair remuneration of journalism lie, or where should it lie? Let's put it that way as well. So that's a question.
I guess in a sort of really practical way, we're looking to the governments that, like South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, that have relatively large markets, that have relatively robust media, that it's not just users, it's also the content, and it's also the ability of the government to do something. So I think those are the places that we're looking at and working with. And we're sort of assuming that, you know, if Brazil can pass a good law, then that will have an impact on others in the region. Same with South Africa. I don't know if you have anything to add.
That's exactly right. I mean, the bargaining power is influenced by the size of the market, the substitutability of the content that's being produced there. So it's much more difficult for Brazilian journalism to be substituted by, let's say, tongue-in-cheek Argentinian journalism, right? So that's there. And crucially, it also depends on the political economy of the country, in the sense that what kind of redressal mechanisms are there in these countries. And South Africa, for example, is very interesting for us because they have this very litigious system, but it's very good because they're able to, you know, maybe approach platforms directly and just file lawsuits to obtain information. So it has to be staggered that way, in the sense that these countries, some countries where you think there's a higher chance of getting a robust and transparent deal, would then set precedents for the respective regions.
Yeah. Well, I guess an hour is up, and I know it's late in the day in Europe. So just really want to thank everybody. We've really enjoyed the CEPR seminars that we've been able to come to. They've been so informative, and you've had such terrific speakers. So we're really grateful and honored to be included. And of course, Julia read a draft of the paper, and her ideas were absolutely terrific, and we incorporated all of them. So thank you very much for hosting us. And both of our email addresses are on our university websites. So we have lots of material. We have you know, videos of Haaris going through the methodology in great detail. So if there's anything you want, or press coverage or any information, please do contact us. And thank you very much. And of course, these slides, anybody who wants can use them. Feel free to put them on your website, refer to them again. And thank you so much for your time, and what great questions from the audience. We're really very grateful.
So thanks a lot to the two of you. For those who did not read your paper yet, I strongly recommend you to do so. It was really great, and thanks for answering all the questions. Thanks for attending this online meeting. So the next meeting will be on May 15. We are going to organize it with Ofcom, which is the UK media regulator. So you should like pencil it on your agenda. Also, I keep repeating it like every time we met, but if you want to send contributions to Vox EU debate, this is very important. So feel free to send us emails with ID you have. And that's all for today. I just want to finish as usually by saying thank you to both Edine and Felipe, who made this meeting possible. So thanks a lot, and see you in on May 15. So it's a little bit like in a very long time, in particular due to personal reasons. But I do hope that you will write columns in between so that we can like keep the discussion together. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.